Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at Winelite, and today we're going to be looking at how to set up Azure AD Connect to synchronize an on-premise domain with Azure Active Directory. Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about Azure AD Connect, and we're going to be talking about how to set this utility up and talk about some of the nuanced options that you can turn on and off to tailor the experience to your liking. But first, let's talk about what this utility is for and why you would want to use it. So Azure AD Connect is fundamentally a service that you run on-premise or in a virtual machine that will synchronize your on-premise Active Directory to Azure AD on Azure. So what this allows you to do is create a more seamless logon experience for users, whether they're logging onto a workstation on your local network or they're logging onto some cloud-based application, say Office 365, or some application that you have running on Azure. What this allows us to do is synchronize the objects from AD on-premise to Azure Active Directory, and I can choose which ones I want to synchronize, and then I can also do things like synchronize passwords and hashes and things like that to allow for a more seamless experience between my on-premise, more traditional network and my cloud-based network that I have running on Azure, and I can create a more seamless experience across this hybrid infrastructure that I'm deploying into the cloud. So let's go install this utility and set it up and talk about some of the options for it and see how it works for creating an online experience that is consistent across all of my infrastructure, being able to log in on-premise and in the cloud. I'm here on a virtual machine, and this virtual machine already has installed on it Active Directory Domain Services. Now, this is a Windows Server 2019 with a vanilla installation of domain services. So I don't really have any kind of customizations going on here. It's pretty much just the out-of-box experience for this particular domain services instance. I've only created a single user. I haven't created any kind of custom groups or anything like that. So this is what I'm going to be using for my demo. Of course, in the real world, your domains probably look much more complicated than this, and you might have multiple domains in a forest, or you might have multiple domain controllers. But in any case, the installation process will look pretty much the same as what I'm doing here, although the nuances of this are going to look a lot different for your domain and your Azure Active Directory on Azure. So this is my new domain services, and I'm going to install the Azure AD Connect on this same box. Now, for a larger domain, you probably wouldn't want to do that. You'd probably want a dedicated box for this because this app can get really chatty across a network that has a large domain that has a lot of activity going on, where you have constant password resets, you have a lot of login activity, you're creating and removing users pretty constantly, and those kinds of things. So that can generate a lot of chatter, and Azure AD Connect needs to be aware of that. So if it's on the same box as your domain controller, then it could really bog down your domain controller. This also installs some other things that we'll look at in just a second. So let's go ahead and launch the installer. But before we do that, I want to show you where to get this from in Azure. So if you go to your AD tenant, the place to get this is to click on the overview tab for your tenant, and then click on Azure AD Connect, and then you can click on this download Azure AD Connect, and this is going to take you to this download page, and then you can download the software to your box that you're going to be running this on. In my case, a domain controller, and that is where I'm going to install it as well. So once I have that downloaded, you can launch the installer. One other thing that you might want to do before you do this is create a custom domain as well. A custom domain will enable you to have a more seamless logon experience for the users that is going to be syncing up to Azure Active Directory, and you want that domain to match your local domain. So my domain on my local box here is called blaze.xyz, and I created a custom domain here. You simply go over here to custom domain, punch in that domain, and then it'll give you some parameters you can put into your DNS, and then you can verify that domain that you own it, and once it's verified, it'll show up here in your domain list. You can also make it primary, and we're going to talk about federation in a future video, but for now, I'm going to be using this custom domain here, blaze.xyz, for this installation. And once you run the installation, you'll get this welcome to Azure AD Connect window, and you simply agree to the license term and click continue. Now, you can take the express settings on this, and for smaller domains, that might be good enough. But for larger domains, probably not going to be what you want to do. So what you can do to customize the installation is click on this customize tab here. And what this will do is take you to this window here where you can specify some specifics about where you want to install things, as well as things about groups and SQL Server. Now, when I specify the custom installation location, that's other than, program files. So if I wanted to put that in the C drive or something like that, that's not a big deal. But for SQL Server, this can be important for larger domains, especially for Azure AD Connect, where it's going to be syncing up lots of objects. You want to make sure that you have a performant version of SQL Server running that's going to be sufficient for your domain. This is going to install, if I just took the express options, it's going to install a basic version of SQL Server called SQL Server Express that's really designed for small websites, and it's really not even something that's very scalable. But for a smaller domain, that's probably fine. It's a free version, so you can use it for some basic stuff, but it's not a full-blown SQL cluster or high performance version of SQL Server, but it does give you some basic functionality that will be fine for this application. If you have an existing SQL Server cluster, you can use that, and that will be the one that you would want to use for larger domains because it's going to have better performance. So if you need that, select that option. If you want to run this under a different service account, you can do that. Otherwise, it's just going to get you a standard account that it might create for you, and that will work fine for your application, or you can take the default on that as well. This custom sync groups here is for permissions on Azure. And the administrative group is a group that you specify that is in your AD tenant that you would put in here that will correspond to administrators on Azure AD. So you can create an administrator, specify your administrator group, and then it will assign those appropriate permissions in Azure AD for administrators. Also for operators, browse, and password reset groups as well. So the permissions that are needed to be assigned on Azure Active Directory will be assigned to the users in these groups, or the groups that it creates up inside of Azure AD based on these groups that you specify here. And the RBAC permissions will be set, and you won't have to do that manually. But that's a feature that you can turn on if you want to, but otherwise you can just take the defaults and use Express. Now I'm going to go with the Express options, but one thing that you can do is if you've done an import, if you've already done this process and you want to redo it, you can do an import synchronization settings here, and you can then import that, and it will load those into Azure AD Connect, and then you can use that rather than having to reset all this stuff up manually. But for my purposes, I'm going to take the Express options, and then I'm going to use these. And the first thing it's going to ask me for is the credentials to log on to Azure. And to get that, I can go to the Azure portal and get that. I need a global administrator. I'm going to be using this account here. And this is one I've already set up as a global administrator on my tenant. And I'm going to put that in, and then I'm going to punch in the password for it, and then log on. It's going to attempt to log on with that user and those credentials, and then it's going to examine those domains. Now this is going to be my local administrator account, so I need to do the administrator at Blaze, if I could type in my own name, .xyz, and then I'm going to punch in the password for this user, and it's going to read my local Active Directory. And the last, this is to avoid synchronization conflicts. That's fine, because I actually had done this and I backed out the settings because I made a mistake when I did it, but this should be fine for my configuration here. And I'm going to run this install and let this actually run the installation of my SQL Server Express and all of the other components for me. So we'll come back whenever this finishes. Okay, it looks like my configuration is done. I can now click on my exit button here, and let's do a refresh here. And there's my new user that it synced up already. And that is the new user that I want to log in with. Okay, let's go ahead and launch the Azure AD Connect software again, and this will allow me to configure some more advanced options here. And it's going to turn off the synchronization scheduler while this wizard is open, so I'm going to quickly walk through this as much as I can. There's a lot in this little configuration utility here. The privacy settings is basically some telemetry out of your Azure AD Connect that Microsoft uses to monitor the experience. It's not giving away any data, but it is something that you can turn off if you don't want to participate in that. This basically gives you the ability to see your current configuration, and you can export the settings if you want. It tells you what you have turned on and off, but that's really all that does. It's just a basic view of what you have turned on and turned off, and an overview of your current synchronization setup. Customized synchronization options is important because there is some stuff on this configuration wizard that I do want to point out, because it does have ramifications on the sign-on experience if you're going to be using Azure AD to sign on using Active Directory accounts that are synchronized. So the connected directories are going to be my local forest here, blaze.xyz, and that's the one I want to use. Here I can select the OUs that I want to put into Azure AD from my local domain. Currently I have everything synced, but if you have a large domain, that's probably not needed, or if you're not doing things like device authentication or these kinds of things, you can turn off things like computers, right? So I could disable the computer objects from going up into Azure. I probably want to enable the users to go up there if I want to enable the more single sign-on experience that I would get with Azure AD using my local domain accounts. But I might not need all this other stuff if I don't need that, such as the computers, or maybe some of my infrastructure components or program data or things like that. So you can disable those if you don't want to put those objects into your Azure Active Directory tenant. But I'm going to basically leave that alone and sync everything, because I don't really have much inside of my domain for this little demo here. So once that is set, you can also set some options here. The ability to create the password hash synchronization is what you need to have turned on so that you can have the single sign-on experience using your domain logons for Azure Active Directory. So you at least need to be able to send your password hashes up to Azure so that those will be available in Azure. Now, if you set up federation, you don't need to synchronize hashes, and we'll talk about federation in a future video. But for now, if you're going to be using Azure Active Directory for your single sign-on, you want that enabled. Now, password write back basically gives you the ability to have password changes in Azure Active Directory synchronized back into your local domain, and that will give you the ability to have those synchronized back. So if I change my password on Azure, I will get that password back into my local domain as well. Now, many people don't turn that on because they don't want to have anybody putting their passwords into Azure and then having that sync back. However, for some people, they want to take advantage of the password reset features available on Azure, and so they enable that. And the password reset features that some people have locally are what they want to use to manage that rather than use Azure, so they don't turn that on. So it's really up to the user to be able to turn that on or off. And some of these other ones are some things like that you can look into, but these are the two main features I want to talk about for the sign-on experience. And once you have those enabled, you can then write the configuration back to your Azure AD tenant as well as your local domain service. Now that I have that configuration of password writebacks, I want to look at two other tools that are available inside of this suite that it installs. One of them is the synchronization rule editor. Now, this one is the ability to customize the synchronization rules that you have inside of your synchronization that is going on between Azure and your local domain. Now, this will give you more fine-grained control over the defaults, and I'm basically using the defaults, which is fine. But if you need to change that kind of synchronization, you can give precedence to specific rules. You can get the kind of object, so a person object connector from Blaze to an account or whatever it might be. You can add these synchronization rules to shape the experience to your liking. So this gives you a very fine-grained control over what is and is synced and how it's synced on Azure, and giving precedence to Azure AD or giving precedence to your local domain and things like that using this utility here. I'm not going to get in the weeds on this, but I do want to make sure that you know it's available if you want to be able to modify or shape the experience more to your liking. And another important tool is one that I think you might end up using at some point, and that's the synchronization service right here. Now, this utility is good for debugging things on Azure and debugging things on your local domain and looking at the things that are synced and things that aren't synced. So you can look at a history of when things were created and what happened. It's not going to give you detailed information really into the kinds of things that were updated, but it does give you the objects that were created. It's not going to tell you exactly what was created, but or synced, whatever it might be. It will show you things that did happen and the amount of activity that's going on inside of each of these syncs that happens. So in the event that you need to review something or to monitor for errors or something like that, this is the utility that you would use to monitor the logging of it. Now, another thing you can do with this utility is actually run a sync. So you can actually force a synchronization to run here. So you can go run and you can do a full synchronization, a delta import, delta synchronization. So in the event that you just kind of want to synchronize everything in your directory and you just want to run that, you can trigger a synchronization using the synchronization service manager. If you say change the password and you want to make sure that gets forced up to the Azure Active Directory from your local account or vice versa, before the next schedule synchronization runs, you can use this utility to do that kind of thing with. So this is a very useful utility. I've found myself using this one more often than the customization rules or things like that. I basically just filter down the organizational units that I want to sync and then use this utility to kind of monitor the state of the synchronization, as well as kick off synchronizations if I need something to sync before the next scheduled sync would happen. So again, a very useful tool for that kind of thing. So let's go back and then log on to my Azure Active Directory using that user that it's synced up, that new user that I created, using the password I created inside of my Azure Active Directory and my local directory, and see if that actually works now. But I need to assign some permissions to it. So let's go back to Azure Active Directory to do that. Okay, now I am back in the Azure portal. So let's go look at my Azure Active Directory to get the principal that I want to assign to. This is that new user that is synced up from my Windows Server AD, which you can see right here. And I want to assign some RBAC permissions to this guy and then log in with him using the password that I used when I created that user in Active Directory. So let's go over here to Azure and let's create something. I've created a resource group already. It's called new user RG. And let's go over here to the IAM controls and let's add a role assignment for my user here. So I should be able to use my select role. I want to select contributor, which should be fine for this. And I want to use a user assigned manual identity, Azure Active Directory user. I'm going to paste in that account and I'm going to select new user and save. And now that user has been assigned to this particular resource group as a contributor. And if I go back to the roles and I can view role assignments, I should be able to see who has access to this. So currently new user does. And so let's go ahead and copy that and let's go get a new incognito tab so that I can go log in with this user. So let's go to portal.azure.com and let's paste in the principal. And let's punch in the password. If everything worked well, the password hash should have synced up. And do I want to stay signed in? and I'm logged in using an Azure AD user. And my Azure AD user was synced up from my local domain, and now I'm using it on Azure just like it would be a native Azure AD account. So maybe later, and I can go to my resource groups here if I want to see those. I should be able to see that new user resource group, and I can then create something, let's say a storage account or something like that. Since I have the appropriate permissions to do this, I can create, and you can see that I'm doing this without any problems. ADSDF. Sure, let's just type in. It's already taken. It's 123. Surely no one has that. Can't be. Let's put some dude. That was not taken. And it's going to validate it, create, and let's wait for this to come back. Okay, my resource is there. Let's go to my resource, and now I have a resource that I'm administrating with my user from my domain services. So again, very powerful utility for doing synchronizations between on-premise domains and Azure Active Directories. It's very easy to set up if you take the defaults, but it's also highly customizable for most user experiences for most domains that you have out there. So we'll be looking at some ways to do some other stories such as federation in future videos, and we'll be using these kinds of things as we walk through this series on Azure security.
If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintellect.com. Until next time, thank you.